كلية الفقه الحنفي تقدم.
بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين، والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Alhamdulillah, we've started looking at some of the scenarios and cases where a person takes an oath and how those are applied. So the first scenario that we looked at was a person took an oath that they're not going to exit the building. So we looked at what it means to exit, that as soon as you're no longer in the building and you're outside, it's exiting regardless of how you exit. So a person says that they're not going to exit, and then somebody else comes and takes them out. So if the person took the oath, instructed that person to take them out, then the oath will break, because the action will be attributed to them. And if they were forced and compelled to come out, then it will not break the oath. And that's another scenario that we looked at, is if a person says, I'm going to exit only for a janazah, and then they go on to do something else. As long as if they exit, I'm only going to exit for a janazah. So if they exit for a janazah, then because that condition of the oath has been met, then the oath will not become invalid, even if they go off to somewhere else. If a person says, I'm not going to leave for Makkah, and then they do leave for Makkah, even though they don't go the whole distance, the oath is going to break because they mentioned leave for Makkah. As opposed to if they said, I will not arrive at Makkah, in that case, until they don't get to Makkah, the oath is not going to break. Then we looked at a case where a person says the wife cannot enter the building except with the permission. Then we said that the wife will need to seek permission each time, unless the husband explicitly mentions that my intention was only the first time. We then had a look at cases of dar, what a dar means, and what happens if the buildings and the structures within the dar are no longer there. The dar still remains as a dar. So if you specify a particular dar, a particular compound, then that compound is, once you enter it, even if there's no buildings, the oath is going to become invalid. And if you said any dar, if you said a dar, a compound, then it goes back to what is customarily understood to be a compound. Then we looked at some few other scenarios of bayt and masjid and the relationship between these two. Inshallah, in the next few videos, we'll be looking at further cases and further scenarios, inshallah ta'ala. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. أما بعد. Okay, so now we have covered all of the introductory discussions in relation to taking an oath, which types of letters and words can be used to take an oath. Now, generally in the books of fiqh, this chapter of oath is actually quite long, but the discussions now don't vary a lot. So there was a lot of introductory remarks. So what different types of oaths, what happens if you break an oath, how do you do kafara, how do you enact an oath, what types of words can be used to take an oath. Now the rest of the chapters of fiqh, the rest of this chapter in the books of fiqh, basically just go through loads and loads of scenarios of a person taking an oath. Because the reason why the aim is to kind of unpack those scenarios, unpack those sentences, and see to what extent that oath takes effect and how is it going to be applied. So from now right till the end of the chapter of Iman, the chapter of taking an oath, all we're going to be looking at is we're going to be looking at loads of different cases where a person has taken an oath, what has actually happened, and whether that person's oath has been broken because of what happened or not. The reason for this is because there are going to be some principles that are going to be extracted. For example, one important principle that we've covered already is that you generally look at what the customary practice is, and you only apply those sentences to the customary practice. After the customary practice, if the only thing that overrides the customary practice is the intention. So just say, theoretically, if the scope of the wording makes all this prohibited, but customary practice only intends this much, then only this much will break the oath. But if the person themselves intended a bit more, then that will also be applicable. And we'll be looking at some of those cases and some of those scenarios as well. So from now on, we're just going to go case by case, looking at a particular oath that a person has taken, the words that they have used, and some of then the juristic explanations and commentary in regards to this. Where there are any usul or any principles that are extracted or derived, then inshallah we will indicate towards what those usul and what those are as well, inshallah ta'ala. So let's start with the first scenario. The first scenario, and what I will do is I will just read it in Arabic as well, so that if somebody was, to reference this in books of fiqh, you will find very similar scenarios written in the Arabic language as well. So if somebody wanted to do further study and look into these in a bit more detail, they will be able to as well. So let me start with, I will start each scenario by mentioning it in Arabic and then explaining it in English and translating it. So حلف لا يخرج فأمر رجلا فأخرجه حنثا وإن أخرجه مكرها لا يحنث. So in this scenario, a person took an oath that they are not going to exit. They're not going to exit. I will not exit. And then they commanded a person to take them out. And that person went and took this individual out. So the fuqaha say that the oath has now become violated. The oath is now broken. Right? So the person said, I'm not going to exit. Then they go and tell somebody to take them out of that room or that building. So that person goes and takes them out. The oath will now become invalid, will have now broken. Penalty will be required. If, however, somebody else came and by force they took the person out against their will, then the oath will not break and the oath will still be intact. So now let's unpack this scenario. Hopefully this scenario is clear. Now, first of all, we have to understand, we have to look at the words that are being used. So he took an oath not to exit. لا يخرج. There will be no khuruj. So khuruj is essentially to go from inside to outside. Khuruj is to go from inside to outside. It doesn't matter whether the khuruj takes place walking, riding. It doesn't matter if khuruj takes place from a door or through a window or through climbing onto the roof and descending from like some fire escape. As long as khuruj takes place, the oath will break. So the person says, I will not exit this room, and then they go and climb out the window. Has exiting been found? Yes, they have exited. But therefore the oath will break. Right? So it doesn't matter how. As long as khuruj is found, the oath is going to break. Now, in the scenario, there were two scenarios that were mentioned. One is, the person says they're not going to exit, and then they go tell somebody to take them out. And in the second scenario, they are forced out without telling anyone. And in the first scenario, where they tell somebody to take them out, the oath breaks. And in the second scenario, the oath doesn't break. Why is this the case? In the first scenario, the action can be directed to the person themselves. Why? Because they instructed somebody else to do it. So even though they did not their body physically exited, right? Their body physically exited. But there's two words here that we have to think about. Khuruj and ikhraj. Khuruj and ikhraj. Khuruj is to exit, and ikhraj is to be taken out. So if I was to walk out of the room, I exited the room. But if somebody grabbed me and picked me up and they took me out of the room, then that's ikhraj, right? So technically ikhraj, if somebody takes me out of the room, that shouldn't break my oath, because that's ikhraj. It's not necessarily khuruj. It's being taken out. It's not exiting, right? So why is it that in the first scenario the oath still breaks even though somebody else took the individual out? The reason why is because they commanded and instructed that person. So X person took the oath and they said to Y that take me out of this room, grab me, pick me up and pull me out of this room, even though it's ikhraj and they were taken out of the room. But because it was done through their consent and they instructed somebody to do it, it will be as though the person themselves had exited. So the parallel that's drawn by the fuqaha is a person, there's an animal in the building. The person mounts the animal. There's a horse. The person mounts the animal, the horse, and then they control the horse and direct the horse to lead them out of the building, right? So you might say that, oh, there's no khuruj there because the person was forced out of the room by the horse. That is true, but the horse was being directed by the individual's movements and actions. So because the individual was instructing the horse and indicating the horse to leave the room, it's as though the person themselves had exited the room. Now, in the second scenario, where there was no instruction given, there was no, the person did not instruct the next person to take them out of the room, that person just forcefully took them out of the room. So therefore, we're not going to attribute the act of khuruj to them. And also this is just pure ikhraj, where you've been taken out of the room. So again, in summary, a person took an oath that they're not going to exit. And then they go and instruct somebody to take them out. The oath will break. Why? Because they instructed somebody, and that action of being taken out is basically attributed to the person themselves. But if they did not instruct somebody and somebody forces them out, then the oath is not going to break. And as we also mentioned, that look, whether you exit from the door or the window or the roof, in all scenarios, the oath is going to break unless somebody specifically mentions the door. If they say, لا أخرج من هذا الباب, I'm not going to exit from this door, then of course, because that's part of the oath, then the oath will also apply to that. Another scenario. حلف لا يخرج إلا إلى جنازة فخرج إليها ثم أتى حاجة أخرى لم يحلف. A person says, I'm not going to leave except to go to a janazah. I'm not going to leave except to go to a janazah. Then the person, they leave the building with the intention of going to a janazah. And then from that janazah, they go to another place as well. So the oath will not become invalid. Why? Because they said, I'm not going to leave except to go for a janazah. So at the time that they left the building, that's when leaving is found. That's when khuruj is found. Khuruj is only found when they left the building. And at the time of when they were leaving the building, the intention was to go to the janazah. The oath has been found and has been intact. And they said, I'm not going to leave unless I'm going to a janazah. And they left when they were going to a janazah. When they left, it was for a janazah. Now, when they then go from the janazah to the next place, that's not khuruj because they've already exited the building. So it doesn't matter how many places they go there, the oath is still going to be intact and is still going to be valid, and there will be no penalty required. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we have now had a look at two scenarios where an individual has taken an oath, and we've analyzed how that oath is going to take effect and what it's going to be applicable to. Now we're going to be looking at the next scenario. So first we mentioned about this janazah case. Now we're going to be looking at another scenario. حلف لا يخرج إلى مكة فخرج يريدها ثم رجع حنثا وكذلك الذهاب في الأصح. Okay, a person takes an oath. I'm not going to leave for Mecca. I'm not going to leave for Mecca. What does that mean? That means when I leave, I'm not going to leave with the intention that I'm going to Mecca. Right? Now what happens? The person leaves with the intention of going to Mecca. They don't get to Mecca though. They go halfway and then they come back. Is the person's oath going to break or not? Yes, the oath is going to break. Why? Because the person said, I'm not going to leave to go to Mecca. They didn't say, I have to get to Mecca. They just said, I'm not going to leave to go to Mecca. And when they left with the intention of going to Mecca. So whether they use the word khuruj or whether they use the word dhahab. So dhahaba means to go. So if they say, la adhabu, I will not go to Mecca. Whether they use khuruj or dhahab, it doesn't matter. If they leave the building with that intention, then the oath is going to break, even if they don't make it all the way there. Now this is different to a person who says ityan or uses the word ityan. I swear by Allah, I will not get to Mecca. I will not arrive at Mecca. Now this person, if they leave with the intention of going to Mecca, but they don't go all the way and then they come back, then the oath is not going to break. Because in this case, the wording that was used is about arriving to Makkah. Right? The first scenario is about leaving to go to Makkah. So you see here how a subtle change of word and the meaning of the word can actually have an impact on the consequences here of whether an oath is going to take effect or an oath is not going to take effect. So khuruj and dhahab means leaving, and ityan means to arrive at a particular destination. Next scenario. حلف لا تدخل امرأته إلا بإذنه فلا بد من الإذن في كل مرة. Right. A person took an oath and they use la and illa. When you have la and illa, it means only. Right? It's like saying innama, only. So they said that their wife will not enter the building except with his permission. The wife will not enter the building, la and illa, except, will not enter the building except with his permission. What does that mean? That means the wife will only enter the building with his permission. The wife will only enter the building with his permission. So how many times does the wife need to now seek permission? The fuqaha say that in this case, the wife needs to seek permission every single time. Why? Every time she wants to enter that building, she needs to take permission, because he said she will not enter the building except with his permission. So either you can, there's two ways of looking at this. Either you can look at this and say, he just means the first time. So once she's entered with his permission, then the oath is fulfilled, and now she can enter as many times as she wants without his permission. It's fine. No. The fuqaha say that la and illa mean only, sir. She will only enter the building with his permission, which means every single time she wants to enter the building, she needs permission. So she wants to enter the first time, she has to get permission and enter. Then when she wants to go again, she has to get permission and she has to enter. But because the wording has an alternative scope as well, potential, if the person turns around and says, no, my intention was only once. My intention was only once, meaning she will not enter the building except with my permission. She will only enter the building with my permission. And he says, my intention is only the first time. Because technically the wording could accommodate for that, the intention will also be taken into consideration. And she will only need to seek permission the first time. She will only need to seek permission the first time. So this is a scenario where they say that she will only enter the building with his permission. So another way of him saying this is illa an adhana laki, unless I give you permission. He says you will not enter the building unless I give you permission. In this scenario, only once is sufficient. Once she has permission, because he says once I have given you the permission, then that's fine. So in this scenario, he's saying once you have, so you will not enter the building until I have granted you the permission. Once the permission has been granted, then she can enter as many times as she wants. Now, when it comes to granting somebody permission, because we're talking about the issue of idhn here, the issue of granting permission, as long as the permission has been granted, it's fine. So for example, the wife was sleeping and the husband comes to her while she's sleeping and he says to her, I give you permission to enter into the building, then the permission will be granted. Why? Because the idhn has already been found. Because he's already granted the permission, it doesn't matter whether she is sleeping or whether she is awake. So this is the scenario of you cannot enter the building unless you have permission. Next scenario. حلف لا يدخل هذه الدار فصارت صحراء ودخلها حنثا ولو قال دارا, as opposed to هذه الدار نكرنا دارا لم يحنث. So what's happening in this scenario? So let's just understand structures for a moment. Dar, sometimes we think of dar as a building or a location. No. Dar is kind of the open space in between houses where there are actually no buildings. So just say, for example, you have a compound. You have an entire compound. You have a court space, open space. And you enter that compound. This is the dar. You maybe have walls around it. It might not have walls. It may have some gated area. And within that compound, you have multiple structures and buildings. And you have open space. And you have a building in open space and a building in open space. So this whole place is the outside perimeter is called the dar. So a person took an oath that I will not enter this dar. I will not enter this dar. Now what happens over time is all the building structures that are contained within the dar, they eventually just collapse, they become derelict, and it becomes like a desert. It becomes like the desert, right? It becomes like the desert. So it's just like you walk there used to be a dar and there used to be loads of buildings. Now the buildings are no longer there and it's just like desert land, right? If a person entered into that location where the dar was, the oath will still break. Why? Because a dar is a dar regardless of the buildings. The buildings are bina. They are structures. Or bait, for example. Those are the structures. But the dar is just the open area. It's just a courtyard space. So when the person said, I will not enter this particular dar, then that location is prohibited for them to enter whether there's buildings or no buildings. So even if there's buildings and then later on the buildings are demolished, it doesn't matter. That location is still there. So once they have entered that space, 50 by 50 meters, for example, then automatically they have entered the dar, even though the signs of the dar are no longer visible, but they have still entered the dar, and therefore the oath is going to break, because they specified a particular dar. Now if a person says, I will not enter, so remember in the phrase used was هذه الدار, it's ma'rifah, it's specific, this particular dar. But the fuqaha say if he said daran, then it will not break. So if he said, I will not enter a dar, I will not enter any dar, right? Now in that scenario, you go back to urf. What is the urf? The urf, when you talk about dar generally, the urf is that a dar which is customarily understood to be a dar, which is the one that you can come in and out of, not one which is just collapsed with no walls and no gates. So when you think of a dar generally, a dar, you're going to go back to what is customarily understood to be a dar, which is kind of a compound where you can enter and exit. So if you said, I will not enter a dar, then you go back to the urf and the custom, which is a normal dar, which you can enter and exit. If you say, I'm not going to enter this dar, I'm not going to enter this particular dar, then in that case, it applies to that particular dar. Even urfan, you apply to that particular dar. So even if later becomes derelict, it doesn't matter. It's still going to break when the person enters into it. I hope that the distinction between the two makes sense, inshallah. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. So we're looking at this case of a dar. So we mentioned that if you say this dar, I'm not going to enter this dar, then orphan as well, you intend that particular location, because you said and you've already described what that location is going to be. So this dar, this area, this location is what I'm not going to enter. So even if the buildings collapse, then it doesn't matter. The urf is still that particular dar and that particular location. But if you say, I'm not going to enter a dar, I'm not going to enter any dar, then in that case, it's going to apply to what is customarily, what is urf known as a dar. A dar is something that has a compound and a structure that you can enter into, even if all the other buildings are not there, but there should be some sort of kind of external structure. Now, another kind of scenario that comes off this is, if we said the dar becomes derelict, meaning the buildings within the dar become derelict, right? So you said, I'm not going to enter this dar, and then the buildings in there disappeared, they're no longer there, but the dar is still a dar, whether it's not been changed into anything else. It's kind of just been left over time and kind of been taken over by the natural elements, right? So the dar is still a dar, essentially. If, however, the dar is converted into something else, and it's no longer a dar at all, it's turned into a hammam, turned into a masjid, it's turned into a palace, it's turned into something different, it's no longer a dar, then in that case, if you enter that area, then you haven't entered the dar. Because you say, I will not enter this dar. Now the dar is no longer a dar at all. Different to the first scenario. The first scenario, just the buildings within the dar disappeared, but the dar is still technically there. But now in this case, the compound is not there. It's been converted. It's been converted into something else. If the person said bait, and they use the word bait, then the bait, whether they said al-bait or a bait, al-bait meaning the house, or baytun, a house, in either scenario, it doesn't matter. In both cases, what's going to happen? In both cases, the oath will not become invalid. The oath will not break. Why? Because in order to enter the building has to be there. So let's go back to the scenario. A person said, I will not enter this building. I will not enter this building. And then they go back and the entire building is demolished and it's no longer there. It's turned into just the desert. And the person enters into that dar location. They haven't entered a bait because there's no bait for them to enter, right? At all. And this is not considered to be a bait. So therefore it will not break. With the dar, there was a slight difference between the ma'rifah and the nakira. Okay, now there are a few other scenarios quite similar to this. A person takes an oath. Halafa. لا يدخل بيتا لم يحنث بالكعبة والمسجد والبيعة والكنيسة. A person took an oath. They will not enter a house. They will not enter a house. I'm not going to enter a house. Then they go and they enter the Kaaba. They enter inside the actual Kaaba itself. Or they enter into a masjid, or a church, or a place of worship. Now this is interesting because technically a masjid is a house. It's the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The masajid, the Kaaba, all of these are considered to be the houses of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So essentially it is a bait. So the word bait can apply to a normal house. It can apply to Baytullah, the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the masajid, and so on. Right? So as you can say, this is what I meant by the word can incorporate this much. But now we look at what's the custom. The customary practice, when a person says bait, they generally refer to a house or a building that is made for the purpose of residing in. Right? When you say bait, customarily between people, when you say bait, you're not thinking Baytullah, you're not thinking house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, you're not thinking masjid, you're not thinking church. You're thinking, I'm going to my bait, I'm going to my house, my place of residence. Oh, where is your bait? Where is your house? Where is your residence? So based on the custom of the time, what do people generally refer to bait? They refer to place of residence. So therefore, if a person said, I'm not going to enter a bait, and they enter the masjid, the oath will not break, because we're going to look at what is customarily meant when a person says bait. The word has scope for this much, but the customary practice is this much. So we're going to apply it to where the customary practice is. Now imagine a person said, I'm not going to enter Dara Fulan. I'm not going to enter a person's residence. Right? I'm not going to enter a person's residence. Then of course it's going to be applicable to where that person is staying. It's not going to apply to any other locations of this. It's going to apply to where the person is staying. Now, if those people are traveling and they're on a journey and they are camping, for example, right, and they have tents up, because you said you're not going to enter the person's place of residence, and for that moment, even though it's not a house but it's a tent, it's going to apply to where that person is staying. So the person's place of residence at that moment is going to be, what? Is the tent. So therefore, because the tent is the place of residence at that moment, if the person entered into that tent, then the oath is going to break. And if they don't enter the tent, then the oath is not going to break. If a person says, remember, intention can override things, right? So intention can override. So if a person says, I will not stay in your residence, and then they're traveling, and on some nights they're staying in a hotel, on some nights they're staying in a tent, and he says, my intention was only the hotel, then you will accept that intention. Say, okay, that was your specific intention, then diyanatan, between you and Allah, that will be accepted. So if you did enter into the person's tent, then the oath will not break. Another scenario, حلف لا يدخل هذه الدار فقام على سطحها حنيفة. A person took an oath, they're not going to enter into this dar, And then what did they do? They went and stood on top of its roof. Or you say, I'm not going to enter into this bait. And you don't enter through the door, but what you do is you go around the back, you climb up the stairs, and you stand on the roof. The oath is going to break. Why? Because when you say you're not going to enter into a particular space, the roof is considered to be part of that space. The roof is considered to be part of that space. And we also know that by looking at, for example, if you look at the case of i'tikaf, i'tikaf has to be done in a masjid. And the fuqaha mentioned that if you do i'tikaf on the roof of the masjid, that is like doing i'tikaf in the masjid. So when you go to Medina Munawwara, for example, in Ramadan, when people are doing i'tikaf, they do i'tikaf on the roof, right? So the i'tikaf is on the roof of the masjid. So by doing i'tikaf on the roof, you are considered doing i'tikaf in the masjid. So we know that the roof is like the inside of the building, right? So the roof, if a person says, I'm not going to enter this building, and they went and they stood on the roof, then the oath is going to break. Now, what if there's other parts of the building? What if there are other parts of the building? Like, for example, you got this roof. Okay, what if there's like a balcony? What if there's like an entranceway? What if there is, different parts of the building? How do we determine if it's internal or external? So the way to determine is any part where if the main door is locked, you can't get out, then that's considered within. Any part of the building where if you were to lock it, that part, if you were to lock the main door, the main gate of that location, the person, they can't get out, then that means they are inside. And if they can't get out, that means they are outside. So for example, they have another case where وَلَوْ دَخَلَتْ دِهْلِيزَهَا إِنْ كَانَ لَأُغْلِقَ الْبَابِ كَانَ دَاخِلًا حَنِثًا وَإِلَّا لَا. Dihliz is like an entranceway, it's like a lobby. So sometimes you have like an entranceway and a lobby, and then you have the building, right? So once you enter the entranceway, have you entered the building or not? Well, they will say, look, if somebody wanted to lock down this building, and you're in the dihliz, you're in the entranceway, are you locked in or are you locked out? If you're locked in, and if that area is considered is locked in and you can't get out, then that means you are inside the building. But if the entranceway is such that the doors are actually in front of you, and you're actually outside the doors, and the entranceway is external to the locks, then that means you are essentially outside the building. So this is how you look at these types of scenarios. Last scenario, we'll end here. Inshallah, we'll have a look at some of the other scenarios in the next videos. Insha'Allah ta'ala. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين والعاقبة للمتقين والصلاة والسلام على سيد الأنبياء والمرسلين نبينا محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين أما بعد. We have now had a look at all the introductory discussions related to taking an oath, such as the different types of an oath, the consequences of breaking an oath, different words and letters that can be used to enact an oath and make an oath come into effect. Now, in the chapter of taking an oath, the fuqaha discuss various different scenarios and cases where they bring statement after statement of people taking an oath, and they analyze those statements in detail and show how that statement is now going to be put into practice and what is going to be the consequences of that statement. So there are going to be cases where an individual utters a statement of oath and it's a very generic statement. Do the fuqaha apply it generally to everything, or are there going to be certain exceptions? Are there going to be certain details? So we're going to be having a look at these types of scenarios. We'll be going through scenario by scenario. Scenario 1, a person said this. Scenario 2, a person said this. Scenario 3, a person said this. And then with each scenario, we're going to look at the wording that has been used, and we're going to look at the application of that wording and what type of actions does the person have to apply in order for the oath to break, and when will the oath break and when will the oath not break. And the purpose of doing this is to kind of get the practice of how to implement the case of an oath and look at scenarios. Because a person generally, what happens is they take an oath and then they want to know, oh, but I did this, is it broken or is it not broken? So we're going to be practicing. This is kind of the implementation stage of the chapter of Iman and Nuzur. Now also, in addition to that, as we are going through the cases, if there are any principles that we can derive from there, we'll be looking at those principles, we'll be looking at those rules that come out, and they will kind of be creating a little framework to go by, so that once we've covered the chapter of oath in its detail, in its entirety, we then have some principles and guidelines that we can use to determine other cases which have not been mentioned by the fuqaha.